Most men don't wake up at 4:47 a.m. because they're disciplined. They wake up because something inside them refuses to sleep. A regret that echoes, a loss that lingers, a quiet war between the man they were and the one they've silently become. If you've ever opened your eyes before the sun and felt like your life no longer belonged to you, as if purpose slipped away somewhere between meetings, mistakes, and missed chances, then this story is for you. Because this isn't about morning motivation. It's about reclaiming identity in the hour the world forgets to look. Stay with me. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover 5 powerful rituals that helped rebuild one man's life and just might give you back control over yours. And if even a small part of you knows it's time, don't just watch. Lean in. That's how it started for David Keller. Not with a master plan or sudden inspiration, but in the silence of his kitchen, bare feet on cold tile, staring at a table that hadn't seen a meal in days. The only light came from a tired street lamp outside, its glow falling across unopened envelopes, a cold cup of coffee, and a family photo turned face down. 6 months earlier, David had titles, a team, a marriage, and momentum. Now, all he had was space, and the realization that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped commanding his life and started reacting to it. It wasn't one event that broke him. It was drift. Quiet, slow, invisible. Until one morning, everything inside him simply said, enough. And though he didn't know how to fix it all, he sensed he could take back 1 hour before the world barged in, before the noise returned, before the algorithms tried to sell him a version of himself he no longer believed in. No one was watching. No one was applauding. But that was the point. He wasn't chasing validation. He was chasing clarity. And clarity doesn't come through noise. It comes through rhythm, structure, and showing up for yourself while the rest of the world sleeps. That's where the rebuild began. And maybe, just maybe, yours will too. The turnaround began at 4:47 a.m. David didn't change overnight. He didn't have a master plan, but the next morning at 4:47 a.m., something felt different. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't scroll. He sat in the same chair, but this time, not to dwell. This time, to move. There was no music, no morning sunlight, no sudden epiphany, just the cold kitchen floor under his bare feet and the weight of a decision that felt too small to matter, yet too important to ignore. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes from drifting too long without direction. And so, he stood up, not to conquer the world, but simply to stop giving it control. He walked to the sink, splashed water on his face, and looked in the mirror, not to admire, not to complain, but to confront. What stared back wasn't a failure. It was a man who had let routine decide who he was. And for the first time, he realized, if he could choose to drift, he could also choose to anchor, not through grand declarations, but through small ownership. Starting now. That morning, David didn't try to fix everything. He didn't write a 10-step recovery plan. Instead, he asked himself one honest question: what if I just owned this hour? Not the whole day, just this one sacred hour. Before the chaos, before the calls, before the world made its demands. That one shift changed everything. Not because it produced instant results, but because it marked the return of self-respect. He wasn't reacting. He was choosing. And in a world full of men who stumble into their mornings half awake and already behind, David was drawing a line in the dark. This hour is mine. No one noticed. But that didn't matter. Because David wasn't doing this to impress anyone, he was doing it to reclaim himself. One ritual, one breath, one silent commitment at a time. And that's where the turnaround truly began. 5. Rituals that rebuilt his life. David didn't rebuild his life through one grand decision. He rebuilt it 1 hour at a time, one morning at a time, one quiet, invisible ritual at a time. And while most of the world was still asleep, he was awake, not just in body, but in purpose. These weren't trendy habits or quick hacks. They were deliberate declarations, acts of discipline that reminded him every morning that he was no longer living by default. He was living by design. What you're about to hear aren't steps to success. They're standards for self-command. Each one shaped the man David was becoming, not by changing his schedule, but by reclaiming his identity. Let's walk through the 5 rituals that rebuilt his foundation. Rituals you can begin tomorrow, if you're ready to stop reacting and start remembering who you really are. Ritual 1. Get up on the first alarm. For most men, the battle begins before their feet ever touch the ground. It starts in the dark, with a vibration, a soft buzz from the phone on the nightstand, a moment so small it feels harmless. And yet, that moment contains the first choice of the day: rise or retreat. David used to hit snooze without hesitation. It was automatic, even comforting. Just 10 more minutes. But it was never just 10. That delay always became a frantic morning, a cluttered mind, a day lived in reaction. The snooze button wasn't just a convenience. It was a quiet act of surrender. And worst of all, it trained him to lose the very first battle of every day. So when David made the quiet decision to reclaim his mornings, this was the first ritual he attacked. Not because he wanted to be a morning person, but because he wanted to be a man of his word. When the alarm rang at 4:47 a.m., he didn't wait for motivation. He didn't argue with himself. He moved. Not because he felt like it, but because he said he would. That's where discipline lives. Not in comfort, but in contradiction. It's the choice to rise while every part of you whispers, later. It's reminding yourself that your word still holds weight, even when no one else hears it. Especially then. It wasn't easy. Some mornings, everything in him begged to slide back under the covers. But he remembered a simple truth. How you start is how you continue. If he allowed himself to delay the first decision, it would bleed into everything. His focus, his health, his direction. The Stoics understood this well. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I am rising to do the work of a human being." That line became David's quiet command. Because this wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about rebuilding trust with the man in the mirror. He started calling it the first victory. Not because it was loud or visible, but because it was honest. A small act of self-respect that shifted everything that followed. With each morning he rose on the first ring. He rose closer to the man he was choosing to become. So the next time your alarm goes off, don't ask how you feel. Ask who you are. Because every morning begins with a question: do you keep drifting or do you stand? And your answer, quiet as it may be, shapes your entire life. Ritual 2. Silence before the world talks. After reclaiming the alarm, David made a second decision. Quieter, but perhaps even more powerful. He chose to delay the noise. No phone, no news, no texts, no inbox. For the first 30 minutes of the day, the world didn't get access to him. Not because he was escaping life, but because he was preparing to lead it He wasn't avoiding reality, he was setting the tone for it. Most men don't realize it, but the moment you reach for your phone before your feet hit the floor, you've already lost something. Not just time, but ownership. A single notification can drag you into a crisis that doesn't belong to you. A headline can trigger fear before you've remembered who you are. A message can pull you into performance mode before you've even connected with your own mind. David used to scroll without thinking. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. It seemed harmless. But what felt like a habit was actually a theft. Those small moments of distraction stole from his clarity, his direction, his inner stillness. And one morning, it hit him like truth often does. Not loud, but undeniable. How can I lead my life if I start every day submitting to someone else's? So he flipped the pattern. He gave himself the gift of silence. Not passive, silence, but powerful silence. He sat. He breathed. No music. No podcast. No stimulation. Just space. Space to let his own thoughts rise before the world rushed in to drown them. It felt strange at first, like something was missing. But that absence was the point. That discomfort was the detox. He was breaking an addiction not to noise, but to dependence. Dependence on being told what to think, what to feel, what to fear. And in that stillness, something began to return, his own voice. Without input, he could feel what truly mattered. He could sense where he had drifted. And he could finally hear the quiet instincts beneath all the clutter, the ones that never left, only got buried. The Stoics knew this intimately. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." But you can't see what's real if your mind is already crowded. That's why David honored this ritual like a sacred meeting with himself. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't even meditation. It was self-respect, the act of holding space before the world tried to take it. And over time, that silence gave him more than clarity. It gave him command. Because if you don't create space for your mind, the world will fill it with noise. And what it fills it with rarely serves the man you're trying to become. Ritual 3. Move before you think. This ritual wasn't about fitness. It wasn't about chasing abs or tracking numbers. For David, this one was about momentum, about taking the stillness he'd created and turning it into movement before the mind had a chance to talk him out of it. Because here's the truth, most men overlook. The body doesn't wait for permission. It responds to action. And motion, especially in the morning, has a way of waking up not just your muscles, but your mindset. David used to sit frozen in thought. At the table, at his desk, at the edge of the bed, his mind would spiral through what he'd done wrong, what needed fixing, what felt broken. And even though it felt like he was working through things, he wasn't moving, he wasn't deciding, he was just circling. Overthinking is just inaction in disguise. It gives you the illusion of progress while keeping you stuck in place. So he created a rule. Before I think too much, I move. Some mornings, it was a walk around the block. Other times, stretching in silence. Occasionally, it was a cold shower. Not for pain, but to break inertia. It didn't matter what he did. What mattered was that he moved before his doubts found him. The Stoics understood this long before modern science did. Seneca once wrote, "The body should be treated more rigorously so that it may not be disobedient to the mind." To David, it meant this: if you want a mind that's steady, build a body that's ready. Not for war, but for presence, for clarity, for showing up without negotiation. He called it activation. Not a workout, but a signal. A reminder to himself, you are not stuck. Your day doesn't belong to fear. It begins with motion. And in that first 5 minutes of movement, something always shifted. His breath deepened. His posture reset. That fog of uncertainty began to burn off. He hadn't solved everything, but he had started. Over time, this simple choice rewired more than his mornings. It reshaped how he entered conversations, how he walked into meetings, how he looked at his own reflection, because he wasn't waiting to feel ready anymore. He was choosing to move forward, even when he didn't feel like it. And that's what changed everything. So the next time you wake up heavy, mentally or physically, don't wait for inspiration. Don't negotiate with the voice that says, later. Move, even if it's just a stretch, a walk, a breath. Movement doesn't have to be dramatic to be powerful. Because the first motion of the day isn't about fitness. It's about declaration. And every step forward says the same thing. I'm not drifting today. Has movement ever saved your mindset? What's one small way you activate yourself? Especially on the hard mornings? Leave a comment below. You never know who might need your story to take their first step. Ritual 4. Write or be rewritten. By the time David had moved, his body was awake, his breath steady, but his mind, still fragile, still vulnerable to the noise, still easily hijacked by old narratives creeping in through the cracks of habit. So before the world could speak again, he picked up a pen, not to plan, not to impress, but to protect his direction. This was the 4th ritual. He didn't do it for productivity. He did it for clarity. Because even with structure and movement, if you don't define your direction each day, the world will hand you its own, and you'll mistake activity for purpose. He didn't write long entries. He didn't journal like he was trying to publish a memoir. He just answered one question, who am I becoming today? And some days the answer came easily. Other days, it didn't come at all. But he wrote anyway. Not because the words were always perfect, but because the act was. Writing became a kind of anchoring, a quiet confrontation between who he was and who he refused to stop becoming. He stopped writing about what he wanted and started writing what he stood for. Not goals, not affirmations, but identity declarations. Things like, I keep promises to myself. I show up even without applause. I don't need noise to be powerful. I lead my life in silence so the results can speak louder. They weren't quotes to post. They were lines in the sand. Small sacred sentences that reconnected him to the man he was building. And over time, they rewired something deeper than his routine. They rewired his inner compass. The Stoics knew this intimately. Epictetus wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." But most men skip the first part. They jump straight into doing, without defining who's doing it, and so they live in motion without meaning. David decided to live otherwise. The page became a mirror that wouldn't lie. It didn't care about reputation. It didn't reward performance. It simply reflected honesty. And that was the point. You don't write because you have clarity. You write to create it, to claim it, to command it, and most of all, to protect it from erosion. So he kept the ritual simple. 1 page, 1 pen, no filters. Just 1 sentence if needed, but never 0. Because even a single line written with intent is more powerful than a day lived without direction. This wasn't about writing to remember. It was about writing to resist the drift, the noise, the roles, the world. wanted him to play again. So tomorrow morning, ask yourself before anyone else does, who am I becoming? Then write it down. Not because you're ready, but because you're deciding. Because if you don't author your identity, the world will. And every sentence you write in silence is an act of resistance. Ritual 5. No input until 9 am. Here's the truth. No one tells you. Most men don't lose their day in the afternoon. They lose it in the first 5 minutes. By letting the world in, before they've even heard their own thoughts. A single notification. One headline. One message. That's all it takes to shift your mood, hijack your focus, and pull you into someone else's urgency before you've chosen your own direction. David learned this lesson later than he'd like to admit. Even after rebuilding his mornings with structure, movement, and silence, he still felt scattered by 8 a.m. Not because he lacked discipline, but because discipline without boundaries eventually leaks. And in a world this loud, your mind will be filled by default if you don't guard it by design. So he drew a line. A firm, quiet, non-negotiable boundary. No input until 9 am. No emails. No news. No texts. No social feeds. Not even just one quick check. Because quick checks turn into quick spirals. And by the time you realize you've handed over your attention, it's already driving the car. This wasn't about disconnecting from reality. It was about connecting with himself first. Before the world started pulling, demanding, selling, he didn't want stillness just for the sake of peace. He wanted it for precision. Because when you let the world speak before you do, you risk forgetting what your voice even sounds like. He started using that early buffer like sacred ground. Some mornings, he read something timeless. Some days he journaled. Sometimes he just drank coffee slowly, letting the silence speak. But always, he stayed away from the digital noise, because he wasn't trying to get ahead. He was trying to stay aligned. The Stoics would have honored this choice. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The things you think about determine the quality of your mind." But today, the challenge isn't just thinking. It's protecting the space to think at all. And that protection starts by deciding who gets access to your mind first. David chose himself. He called it mental fasting. Not to punish, but to purify, to keep his mind light and clear before the clutter could sneak in. And what he noticed was subtle, but undeniable. His decisions became sharper. His energy lasted longer. He wasn't behind anymore, because he'd stopped letting the outside world set the tempo of his inner life. So, tomorrow morning, don't reach for your feed. Reach for your breath. Sit still. Think clearly before the noise tells you what to fear, what to want, who to be. Because clarity doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under everything you let in too early. And if you want to own your day, own your attention. Before 9 a.m., before the world gets a chance. How these rituals transformed everything. There's a shift that happens when you stop chasing control over the world and start creating command within yourself. That's what these rituals gave David. They didn't make his life easier. They made him clearer, quieter, stronger. It didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic before and after photo, no viral success story, no applause. But day by day, ritual by ritual, something began to shift. Quietly, powerfully, and permanently. At first, it was subtle. David noticed he was less reactive. He no longer started his days with anxiety in his chest. He didn't feel like he was chasing time, trying to catch up to a life that felt bigger than him. Instead, he began to lead, not by controlling everything, but by controlling himself. There was a groundedness in him now, a stillness, the kind of calm that doesn't shout but changes the atmosphere when it walks into a room. His posture changed, his presence sharpened. He listened more, spoke less, and chose his words with weight, not because he wanted to appear wise, but because his mind had become quieter. And in that stillness, clarity rose. He stopped rushing. He stopped apologizing for taking space. He stopped doubting every instinct. When you spend the first hour of every day honoring your direction, you stop looking for outside permission to follow it. The changes leaked into his work. He showed up prepared, not just with information, but with intention. He wasn't trying to impress anymore. He was focused, present, effective. The same colleagues who once dismissed him started asking for his input, not because he demanded respect, but because he embodied it. At home, he was no longer a man lost in thought, distracted at the dinner table, or quick to frustration. He didn't just spend time. He brought his full self to his time. And his relationships began to heal, not through apology, but through consistency, through the way he showed up, over and over, without having to say a word. This wasn't reinvention, it was return. Return to self-trust. Return to alignment. Return to the quiet strength he forgot he had. Because when a man commits to something simple, small, and sacred every day, it rewires more than his habits. It rewires his identity. David didn't need more motivation. He needed rhythm. And now, that rhythm was running deeper than ever, because these rituals weren't just habits anymore. They were who he had become. The quiet rebuild no one saw. There were no announcements, no social media updates, no grand gestures or motivational speeches. David didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He didn't need to, because some rebuilds don't happen in public. They happen when no one's watching, when the lights are off, when the room is quiet, when a man chooses to show up anyway, morning after morning, hour by hour, repetition over recognition. While the world measured progress in posts and promotions, David measured his in presence, in how calmly he could sit with himself, in how rarely he doubted his own word, in how deeply he could trust the man in the mirror, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest. The truth is, no one saw it happen. There was no applause when he started waking up early, no reward for skipping the scroll or choosing silence over stimulation, no trophy for showing up to write when his thoughts were a mess. But that was never the point. Because real transformation doesn't need to be witnessed, it needs to be lived. And David lived it, one morning at a time. He stopped waiting to be seen. He stopped needing proof that he was on the right path. Instead, he let the discipline become the proof, the routine, the rhythm, the quiet, sacred rituals that stitched him back together, not for the world's approval, but for his own peace. He no longer needed to declare, "I've changed." His eyes said it. His posture said it. His presence said it. And over time, the world adjusted. Not because he demanded anything, but because people respond differently to a man who no longer doubts himself. David didn't rebuild through noise. He rebuilt through silence. Not to be impressive, but to be undeniable. Not every man needs to hit rock bottom to rebuild, but every man eventually faces a moment where he must decide, will I keep drifting through days I barely remember, or will I take back the hour that shapes everything that follows? It's not a decision between success or failure. It's a decision between living reactively and living deliberately. Because discipline isn't about being perfect. It's about remembering who you promised yourself you would become, and choosing him again every morning. David didn't rebuild through noise, and he didn't wait for inspiration to strike. He created rhythm, and that rhythm built trust, not with others, but with himself. His rituals weren't flashy, but they were honest. They didn't make him extraordinary overnight, but they made him consistent. And in a world that rewards distraction and speed, consistency is the rarest form of power. So what about you? What would happen if, starting tomorrow, you stopped letting your phone, your inbox, or your doubts dictate your direction, and instead reclaimed your first hour with quiet intent? You don't need to conquer the day. You just need to begin it like you mean it. Wake up when you said you would. Sit in silence before the noise finds you. Move your body before your thoughts stall you. Write who you're becoming before the world writes over you. And most of all, protect your mind from input that doesn't serve your purpose. Even if no one notices, even if it's hard, even if some mornings feel slow or messy, show up anyway, because this isn't about being motivated. It's about being loyal to the man you're becoming. And over time, that loyalty becomes clarity, that clarity becomes rhythm, and that rhythm becomes freedom. If this spoke to something inside you, like the video. If you're already walking this path, drop a comment below. What's one ritual that's changed how you show up for your life? Your story might be exactly what another man needs to keep going. And if you're ready to stop reacting and start rebuilding, subscribe, not for the algorithm, but because you've made a decision to build your life before 9 a.m. And that next chapter begins now.